Welcome, everyone, to the third and final webinar in the SPED Ahead 2015 Fall Series on School Climate Change with Positive Behavior Supports. I'm Clay Whitehead, your host. I'm the co-CEO and co-founder of Presence Learning. We provide online speech, occupational, and behavioral therapy services to thousands of schools across the country. The response to this series has been nothing short of phenomenal. We have thousands of special educators participating in each and every single webinar. Dr. Joe Ryan kicked off the series with a comprehensive look at how we can use data to make better choices about behavioral interventions. Then, Michael Gamble-McCormick and Dan Crimmins helped us to understand the reasons behind the momentum in schools to replace reactive behavior interventions with positive preventative methods. Dan used SCERTS as an example of an evidence-based instructional model that is having fantastic results in helping struggling students regulate their behavior and to be more successful in school and in their careers. SCERTS is an important way for your classrooms to become better learning environments with less stress for you and better outcomes for your students. That's the essence of school climate change, and SCERTS is the topic for today's webinar, and a very appropriate way to wrap up this amazing series. We are thrilled to have with us three of the developers of the SCERTS model, Barry Prezant, Emily Rubin, and Amy Laurent. Together, along with Amy Weatherby, they developed the SCERTS model over a decade ago and have trained over 20,000 educators around the world to integrate this approach into their special education programs. They're here today to tell you about this groundbreaking approach, a way for many students who really struggle in school and have not responded well to other types of therapy to do a whole lot better. Now, let me introduce you to today's speakers. Dr. Barry Prezant is no stranger to SPED Ahead. He is one of our most popular webinar speakers, an expert on behavioral therapy and approaches. You can see on your screen Barry's impressive resume, but let me just sum it up for you. He has, for over 25 years, been on the front lines helping educators understand how to compassionately help children succeed in school and beyond. He is one of the world's leading authorities for advising families and educators of children with autism and how the SCERTS model can have a positive impact. Barry's book, released in August by Simon & Schuster, is called Uniquely Human, A Different Way of Seeing Autism. The book has received critical acclaim and has propelled Barry into the limelight with dozens of interviews on TV, radio, and in publications. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Emily. Emily Rubin is an educational outreach specialist at the Marcus Autism Center, an academic affiliate of Emory University in Atlanta, and a National Institute of Health Autism Center of Excellence. She is a speech-language pathologist specializing in autism, Asperger's syndrome, and related social learning disabilities. Emily lectures internationally and provides consultation to educators who serve children and adolescents with autism and related developmental disorders. She is also the co-author of the SCERTS assessment process. And last, but certainly not least, is Amy. Amy Laurent is a pediatric occupational therapist with a master's degree from Boston University in special education and is co-author of the SCERTS model. She has a private practice specializing in the education of children with autism spectrum disorders and related developmental disabilities. Amy provides educational services to clients, and she is a consultant to those who lead educational programs that serve individuals with ASD. Like her colleagues, Barry and Emily, she lectures and provides training throughout the United States and internationally on the SCERTS model and other topics related to therapeutic and educational interventions for children with autism. So, with that introduction to this amazing team of professionals, I'm turning the program over to you, Barry.
Thank you so much, Clay, and it's a pleasure to be back with you again and working with the great folks at PL, that is Presence Learning. And today I'm just so pleased to be able to talk about the SCERTS model, a model that I've developed with my collaborators, and two of my collaborators, Amy Laurent and Emily Rubin, will be sharing the time with me in talking about the SCERTS model. In addition to Emily Rubin and Amy, who you'll be hearing from, another collaborator who's not with us today is Dr. Amy Weatherby, who is a distinguished research professor at Florida State University. In today's program, we will be talking about a number of issues related to SCERTS and really try to give you a good feel of what the SCERTS model is about. I'll begin with an overview of the SCERTS model. Amy will then pick up talking about two of the priority domains in SCERTS, social communication and emotional regulation. Emily will then pick up and talk about implementing SCERTS, including the important domain of transactional supports, and I'll be coming back for a brief wrap-up after that. So SCERTS is an acronym, and the acronym SCERTS stands for the three domains that we feel are most important to focus on, not just for students and individuals with autism, but those with problems in social communication and emotional regulation. And of course, the first two webinars as part of this series focused on those students who have challenging behaviors, and we'll be talking about that in great depth in terms of how it fits into our approach in the SCERTS model. So SCERTS stands for social communication, emotional regulation, and transactional support. And we believe these are the domains, and research supports the fact that these are the domains that really provides a comprehensive program for students who have challenges in social communication and emotional regulation. And of course, we will pick apart and define these concepts for you as we move ahead. In reference to social communication, just briefly, we're talking about the ways that children are able to engage with others, able to engage in reciprocal interaction, and communicate their intentions, whether it be through nonverbal means, verbal means, or augmentative communication means. When we talk about emotional regulation, we are talking about the capacity to be available for learning and engaging, and how important that is in the school context for students. And Amy will be expanding upon how important that is as a preventative measure against problem behavior, something that Dan Crimmins spoke about in great depth, and Joe did especially from a data collection standpoint. Transactional support, we'll be talking about all of the ways that we support students in communicating, learning, being well-regulated, and we also include the ways we support families and we support each other under the transactional support domain. So just a few little snapshots for you to illustrate some of what we're talking about and what we prioritize in the SCERTS model. Here is a picture of a youngster who's about 3 years of age, communicating quite effectively at snack time. And this youngster is using what we refer to as a contact point to indicate that he wants grapes by pointing to a picture of grapes. And he has a sippy cup if he wants something to drink. And he also has a very engaged partner. In the SCERTS model, we really value the role of partners, and Emily will be talking about that in much greater depth as well. So here is a student able to express his intentions clearly, sharing positive emotion in a typical everyday routine and situation, which is something else that we value greatly in the SCERTS model. In terms of emotional regulation, here's an elementary age student who is with her support person, and they're just about to engage in some academic support activities. Now, looking at this student, we would say, yes, she does look available for learning and engaging. She's expressing positive emotion, her body looks relaxed, and she looks like she's ready to learn. So it's very important for us in the SCERTS model to understand the signals that children give us that tell us that they're ready to learn, and conversely, the signals that they give us that tell us that they need more support, that they're becoming emotionally dysregulated. Finally, here is a middle school student, and he is in what we would refer to as a high-risk situation for being challenged, for being dysregulated. And one of the things we really try to get across in the SCERTS model is that the great majority of so-called problematic or challenging behavior comes out of a dysregulated state. So while he's waiting to see the dentist, which is a high-risk situation, he has a number of supports in place. He has headphones that maybe allows him not to hear some of the aversive auditory stimulation. He has a time timer, which allows him to know when he will go in to see the dentist. He also has a little fidget toy. It happens to be Shrek. He enjoys Shrek, but it also gives him something to do with his hands to stay well regulated. And he has a calendar on his leg as well that helps things be predictable, so he knows what he's done, where he is now, and what will be happening in the future. In Emily's portion of the presentation, she'll be talking a lot more about the kinds of supports that we use in the SCERTS model. There are many contributing sources of research that underlie the SCERTS model because it is a research-based model, both in terms of the basis of the model as well as efficacy research published over the last few years that demonstrates that the SCERTS model is effective. And I'll just mention a few of these very quickly. We base much of our curriculum on goals and objectives that come out of the research on primary challenges in autism and related disabilities. Also the research on neurological differences and the basis of those neurological differences, especially in terms of social competence. Research on learning strengths, especially the strong visual processing strengths of most people with ASD and most students with ASD. We are a developmentally based model, so our curriculum and our strategies need to be developmentally appropriate, and we are informed by the research on child and human development. We are a family-centered model, so we really incorporate our understanding of the impact of disabilities and autism on families. In a few minutes, we'll be talking about the fact that SCERTS is a framework that allows us to pull in many different effective, focused intervention strategies. And we certainly are greatly influenced by people with autism and related disabilities. We all have worked with, we all have presented with adults and older individuals with autism and related disabilities, and that really informs us in terms of the priorities. In other words, what's most important to work on. So who is the SCERTS model for? Well, being a comprehensive intervention model, we really are very proud of the fact that it is now being implemented nationally and internationally with a full range of ages of students and people with disabilities and a full range of abilities. Now, operationally, the way we organize that is according to 3 partner stages, and each partner stage relates to a specific curriculum of goals and objectives that are developmentally appropriate for that stage. So the 3 stages, just generally now, are what we refer to as social partner, language partner, and conversational partner. And these stages are defined by abilities in initiated social communication. So social partners are those who are communicating primarily through gestures and vocalizations because they are at a pre-symbolic level of functioning. Language partners are those who are moving into symbolic means to communicate and are beginning to use speech, photos, picture symbols, sign language, and maybe even speech-generating devices. And then finally, conversational partners are moving into much more sophisticated language and reciprocal communication. And what's very important to understand is that can occur through speech or through augmentative communication. So you can be a conversational partner and not be a speaker, but still be able to use more sophisticated linguistic means and talk about more complex symbolic information such as past and future events. So as I've noted, SCERTS is a framework that embraces focused evidence-based approaches. And in this slide, we try to depict that for you by demonstrating that various forms of augmentative communication, picture exchange is definitely, or we could pull strategies from these areas that definitely help us to achieve goals and objectives in the SCERTS model. Some of the use of visual systems that were developed by TEACH over the years. TEACH was one of the first approaches in autism to extensively use visual supports such as calendars and organizational systems. And then other strategies that are evidence-based, including social stories and the Hannon approach to support families, would fit nicely under the framework and under the umbrella of SCERTS. And all of these in our model would fall under the category of transactional supports for social communication and emotional regulation. So in 2013, Wang and colleagues at UNC Chapel Hill came out with an important document, which was a review of evidence-based practices for individuals with autism. And they noted that evidence-based approaches must be selected to address a range of intervention priorities for social and emotional competence. So this is what the SCERTS model really focuses very specifically on, developing social and emotional competence in the students we support. And that a comprehensive framework is needed to guide the individualized selection of strategies that best match a child's most critical priorities. And so SCERTS was designed to address these needs. In fact, SCERTS was around a good decade and a half before this document was published. And we have been delighted that as we've moved into the more recent intervention approaches, the next generation of intervention approaches, that many people are finding that SCERTS kind of predated the call for those elements that are needed in comprehensive approaches. So I want to review the core values guiding principles that we've come up with that really underlie the practices that we engage in the SCERTS model. And we believe very strongly it's essential for any approach to have core values and guiding principles so we know what we're doing and we can always refer back to them to make sure we're engaging in fidelity of practice. Dan Crimmins spoke about the importance of fidelity of practice regarding PBIS, and certainly we are very, very focused on that in the SCERTS model, because unless you have practices that are consistent, that's used by a wide variety of teams in similar ways, you can never document progress and say this is why this progress is being made. So just by the name SCERTS, it should be obvious that our highest priority is the development of spontaneous functional communication abilities and emotional regulatory capacities. And that we also, in the SCERTS model, really focus on multimodal strategies for teaching and for communication. That would include gestures, pictures, picture symbols, sign language, speech, whether it's natural speech or through speech-generating devices, and written language. And you'll see some wonderful examples that Emily will share with you about how these different multimodal approaches are used to support not only social communication, but emotional regulation as well. As I mentioned, we are a developmentally based model. Therefore, goals and activities must be developmentally appropriate and functional. And we would just like to add to the previous two webinars as part of this series that one of the major issues around students having problematic behavior and challenging behavior is when practices are not developmentally appropriate for them. So we, being developmentalists, we believe very strongly that we need to put a lot of time and energy into making sure we are developmentally appropriate. We also view all domains of development as interrelated and interdependent. So just a very quick example. We might think of working on handwriting simply as an activity that demands some academic skills and some motor planning and fine motor skills. But for students who've had negative experiences and challenges in those aspects of developing handwriting that's legible, it also is a great socio-emotional challenge. So from the SCERTS model perspective, we would make sure to build in socio-emotional and emotional regulatory supports, knowing that these domains are not separate domains and all influence a child's learning and participation. So that requires that we have multiple objectives for each activity. Many of the skills that are required for success in activities, whether it be in the community, at home, or at school, requires a number of different abilities, especially in social communication and emotional regulation. We view all behavior as purposeful, serving a variety of functions, and Dan spoke about the major functional categories that are used in doing a functional behavioral assessment, and we value those categories, but we tend to be even more specific in terms of the 4 categories that he reviewed as important categories, and those were escape, attention, seeking something tangible, and sensory. And we try to dig in a little bit deeper. Rather than the function of just saying sensory, that the child is seeking sensory stimulation, we would want to know why is that student doing that. And Amy will be talking about that a little bit more in the next section on emotional regulation. We really value understanding a child's strengths as well as challenges and making sure that we use a child's strengths, interests, and motivations for appropriate accommodations and for the way we design activities. So whenever possible, we want to build in a student's strengths and motivations infused in activities. We know, unfortunately, some of our students that we're supporting are not motivated by some of the same contingencies that other children are. And a great way to help with that motivation is building in those strengths and motivations. We value natural routines across homeschool and community environments, not only in the way we do assessments of kids, but certainly in the implementation of strategies to help students reach the goals and objectives that we set in our curriculum. And the last two have to do with the family-centered piece of the SCERTS model. We believe it's the primary responsibility of professionals to establish positive relationships with children and family members, and that all children and family members are treated with dignity and respect. Many of you in the audience realize that a great challenge you often face is having parents carry through at home some of the suggestions we make or strategies that we're using at school. And a very important piece of that is developing that trusting relationship, which we put a lot of energy into. And one way we do that, by the way, is including parents and family members in the assessment process by using their knowledge and their expertise. So family members are considered experts about their child, and we always are looking for collaborative processes and engaging families to the extent that they're capable of being engaged with us and that they want to be engaged with us. So just as a quick summary, the SCERTS model is child-centered and highly individualized, developmentally grounded, team-based, and yes, the SCERTS collaborators represent a team of speech-language pathology, occupational therapy, special education, with all of us trained in behavioral and developmental psychology. We value natural activities and routines. We're activity-based, family-centered, and evidence-based as well. So it's my pleasure to hand the baton over to Amy Laurent, who will speak in much greater depth about the first two domains of the SCERTS model, social communication and emotional regulation.
Thank you, Barry. I'd like now, as Barry said, to shift to talk about some of the primary domains of the SCERTS model and why they're included in the model. So as previous presenters in this series, Dr. Ryans and Dr. Crimmins, have alluded to, many factors underlie behavioral challenges that are often seen in students. Oftentimes, social connectedness, language difficulties, regulatory challenges, and environmental attributes are key factors. SCERTS prioritizes supporting a child's development in these areas at various levels of intervention. So much of what Barry has already spoken about are points that are consistent with the Tier 1 and Tier 2 interventions that were outlined by Dr. Crimmins. But SCERTS is also very useful in designing Tier 3 interventions for individual students. So SCERTS recognizes that social connections provide the fuel for social emotional development throughout childhood, adolescence, and on into adulthood. And as social emotional development is critically linked to active engagement, competence, and quality of life for an individual student, it's also critically linked to positive school culture and environment. So it's important to spend a few minutes talking about a simplified view of social emotional development and why it's a priority to build this as a capacity in our students. While infants' brains are socially immature at birth, most young children and infants are born with a drive to connect socially. This, paired with supportive and responsive, loving environments, results in young children falling in love with their social world. It's this interest in the social world which provides fuel for further development. Secure relationships give rise to lots of opportunities for initiations and interactions which are both verbal and nonverbal. These interactions correlate to young children having greater opportunity to engage in learning opportunities and seek out social connections. The seeking out of these social connections allows for expanded opportunities and expanded interactions with responsive and supportive partners. And in turn, these increase a child's confidence, competence in interactions, and in turn again, create social successes, increasing more opportunities for learning and interacting with others. This is truly a scenario where practice doesn't make perfect, but it really does make better. Children at this stage of development are able to use their language abilities to be able to plan, but also to maintain relationships and fit in with peers. So if we look at this as a whole, this is really the foundation of social emotional development, and it's supportive but also intricately intertwined with communication development and emotional regulatory development, as well as other developmental capacities that Barry already alluded to. Now, notice I didn't really talk about social skills up to this point, because skills are often viewed as isolated abilities. It can be trained, but what we're really talking about within the context of SCERTS is supporting a developmental capacity that a child will have the prior knowledge and abilities that they need to independently utilize and demonstrate skills. So if we take a step back and we think about students in our lives and in our caseloads who have difficulties in these areas or who struggle in these areas well beyond the early childhood years, we have to ask ourselves the question, how do we support these connections? What do we do to provide support to help the child with these difficulties? And this is really where SCERTS comes in. SCERTS provides us with a framework for selecting goals and objectives that will really help to propel a student's development forward in key areas that increase active engagement and interaction while also lessening problem behaviors. The first area or domain of the SCERTS model to consider is the S and the C of the model, social communication. So the social communication domain has a curriculum which is focused on helping a child to be increasingly competent and confident and actively participate in social activities. This includes things such as engaging in relationships as well as at play. So when we refer to the curriculum throughout this next part of the talk, it's important to put this in context. Our curriculum is really a scope and sequence of goals and objectives that we use in our assessment process as well as our intervention process. So SCERTS is designed as an assessment to intervention process in terms of goals and objectives which a child is assessed upon are then selected and included in their educational plan as appropriate. So within the context of social communication, there are two different components in the model that we're very concerned about understanding a child's abilities. The first is joint attention, and joint attention is why children communicate. This is where social reciprocity and motivation come in, but it's also the functions of communication. So we're thinking about, does the child communicate for behavior regulation, for requesting and protesting? Are there more social functions of communication, such as showing, calling, greeting? Or do we see truly co-constructed experiences in play? We're going to assess the child's abilities in those areas and identify where the next developmental targets for intervention are. We're also going to assess how they communicate, and this is the symbol use portion of the model. The symbol use, again, refers to the means that a child is using to communicate. So we talk about things like nonverbal signals, facial expressions, proximity, gestures, but also symbolic means. And as Barry alluded to, SCERTS is a multimodal approach. So we could be talking about spoken words, but we could be also talking about signs, pictures, or other augmentative systems. But it's critical for us to understand both how and why a child is communicating. And reflecting again upon the points that both Dr. Crimmins and Dr. Ryans raised, that behavior is often communication. And SCERTS fully embraces and is actually predicated on understanding that concept, that behavior is communication. And we're always looking at a child's behavior in terms of how and why a child is using a certain behavior to communicate. The next slide actually outlines priority areas for intervention that are critical within SCERTS for helping students develop greater social communicative abilities and in turn supporting their social emotional development. So at the before word stage, and as Barry talked about, these are our social partners, our developmentally youngest individuals according to our curriculum, our priority becomes spontaneous pre-verbal communication. So spontaneous gestural communication. Our goal is for that child to develop a high rate of initiation because there's research to support that high rate of initiation correlates to the development of symbolic abilities. So that's going to help move the child into that next stage of our curriculum, the language partner stage. The language partner stage are really children who are at that emerging language stage. They have early words and may have some simple sentence structures or simple word combinations. And our goal for these children is to really help move them to be conversational in their ability to use language. So in order to do that, our highest priority becomes helping them use different word types, because different word types are going to allow that child to develop and express creative thought. If the children are able to express creative thought, they'll move into the conversational partner stage, which is our most sophisticated stage within the model. And for children at the conversational stage, our priorities really start to build around self-efficacy, and helping that student adhere to social conventions. So I've got a few slides depicting this in a little greater detail to give us a little bit more information. Here we can see that for the children who are social partners, so the pre-symbolic children, our primary goal is trying to select those objectives within the SCERTS framework which help move towards that high rate of spontaneous communication, and really shifting away from what we traditionally see as priorities in educational plans around following directions. Again, we've got to kind of put our eye on the prize and figure out what's going to give us the most bang for our buck in terms of social emotional development for kids, and we know that that increase in initiation will help move that child to being able to develop symbolic means, and symbolic means often really helps a child be able to express themselves in conventional ways and not rely on problem behaviors to communicate. And when we think about children at the language partner stage of development, we really do want to make sure that we're looking towards our curriculum, understanding that child's developmental profile, and figuring out how we're going to launch that child towards the conversational stage. So many of the goals and objectives at this stage are really focused on acquiring language that is going to help that child with socially directed vocabulary. So oftentimes we'll see in a traditional IEP focus that there'll be goals around acquisition of words or vocabulary, and many times it's simply the acquisition of nouns. Now, if we think about the acquisition of nouns and expanding vocabulary, we know that you can't create a novel sentence or an idea out of nouns. It simply can't be done. So we need to make sure that we're fueling that child's social brain and that social connectedness and keeping them connected to other people, but also giving them the word types that will allow them to express creative thoughts. So we're going to bring in making sure that children have people's names as well as actions. And again, this type of language is going to feed that social emotional development, which is our goal, but also help move us towards more creative language. And you can see in this particular photo, this is a kindergartner engaged in a journaling activity, and it's hard to see the specifics, but you see the different words at the bottom of the page, and you can see the sentence structure. So here she's learning to use language to connect with a teacher, actually her speech pathologist in this picture, around a social event and share information about that social event. And to do that, she has different word types. Now, SCERTS is really a natural activity model, and we really prioritize intervening in natural routines, such as the kindergarten journal that you just saw. But if we're choosing an objective which is going to expand word types for a child, we're going to make sure that that happens across many different activities in the child's day. So here you get to see a picture of Emily. That is Emily Rubin, who will be talking in a few minutes. And this is a sentence strip or a word strip or word combination strip which shows Emily open yogurt. So we've got that social focus on Emily, the action of what we want to be done, as well as the object. This could be used during the child's breakfast or snack or lunch. But again, this type of support infused throughout the child's day is going to help teach the child the power of language as well as fuel that social connectedness. It's not that I just want the yogurt open, but I need somebody to help me with that. So I'm able to ask for that type of assistance. This slide really depicts priorities for children at the conversational partner stage, so the developmentally most sophisticated kids within the social communication curriculum. And one of our primary goals, as I've already mentioned here, is really building self-efficacy around social norms. So we want to increase a child's success in social interactions as well as their competence. So if we do that and we prioritize that for children at this stage, we're going to open even further learning opportunities for that child in terms of very important skills, especially in relation with peers, such as negotiation. So our implication here is that we're really hoping to move beyond surface behaviors, such as social skills, to real social understanding so that the child is able to modify their behavior based on the environment that they're in. This will bring us to the second domain that I want to talk about, which is the emotional regulation domain. And within emotional regulation, as Barry mentioned, emotional regulation within SCERTS is really focused on supporting a child's ability to regulate their emotional arousal and to be more available for learning and engaging. So here again, SCERTS gives us a framework for developmental priorities according to social partner, language partner, or conversational partners, which will allow us to assess the child at an appropriate developmental level and select intervention goals or objectives. So emotional regulation is really the ability to shift your arousal level or your emotional state to meet the demands of the social and the physical environment. And it relies on developmental capacities in terms of self-regulation and mutual regulation. Self-regulation are basically the strategies that a child has at their own disposal to help regulate their arousal and emotional state. And mutual regulation are those strategies that occur within the context of a relationship with somebody else. So how the child's able to request assistance from somebody else or to respond to assistance offered by somebody else. These are the tools that are so important in helping us to tolerate transitions, cope with difficult situations, delay gratifications, contain excitement, and all of those things. So much like we've talked about social communication can be intertwined with problem behavior or expression of problem behavior, emotional regulation is really critically linked to problem behavior because it's often difficulties with regulatory strategies and employment of regulatory strategies at appropriate developmental levels, which results in a child exhibiting problem behavior. It's important to mention here just for a minute that these two skills or abilities develop simultaneously and in an interconnected way. So it's often that a child will acquire a new self-regulatory strategy through a successful mutual regulatory interaction with a partner. So this is just critical to keep in mind because SCERTS is a transactional model, and we truly view that the partner behavior, what the partner does, influences what the child's able to achieve, and that's critically linked here in emotional regulation. This next slide parallels the one that we've seen previously, and it shows us that there are priority interventions or priority goals or objectives at our different stages of development. And so for our social partners, again, those are our pre-symbolic communicators, so any age but who are pre-symbolic in their communication, the developmentally youngest. Our priority are helping these children to develop, or these students to develop, sensory motor behaviors to both soothe and alert. So this is helping a child use the environment or the property of the environment or activities to help maintain their engagement. It's also to help these children respond to assistance from their partners. At the language partner stage, our priorities shift a little bit because these children now have the ability to use symbolic means. And so we want to help them use symbolic means, so words, whether they're pictures, signs, or some other symbol, to help support their engagement. And so this might be words around emotional expression. It also might be words around understanding temporal concepts, a way to use language to start to organize and make sense of the environment in terms of being able to predict what's going to happen and being able to cope with what's happening around them. We also think about children at this stage being a little bit more aware of what's happening in their environment and what social conventions are. So again, thinking about sensory motor strategies for these children, but potentially moving towards things that might be more conventional or thinking about what might be more appropriate within the context of a classroom. And then conversational partners, again, these are the developmentally most sophisticated kids who are communicating through spoken discourse or some other augmentative means, but more in terms of generative language. These students were thinking about moving towards the ability to use executive functioning as well as metacognitive strategies. And so when we think about children at this stage, these are kids or students that we're really hoping to support their ability to be reflective. So to think about, in this context, what strategy is going to be most effective or most successful. Again, as you look across this, you can see there's a real desire to increase the ability of the child in terms of their own developmental capacities. So SCERTS is not about behavior management. We're not putting systems in place to control the child. Rather, we're supporting the child's development of both self-regulatory and mutual regulatory strategies, which will put that child in a position of having greater skills or abilities. So when they confront potentially dysregulating circumstances, that they have the tools that they need so that they don't rely on or fall back on behaviors that might be problematic. So we've got a few slides just to depict this here as well. So for the social partner, we mentioned that writing goals focused on using effective sensory motor strategies is important. Again, making sure that we're shifting priorities from managing behavior to regulating emotion and arousal is critical. So really understanding the root of the behaviors that we see in children and feeding that need and helping that child accomplish it in a more efficient or effective way. At the language partner stage, you can see here's an example of a transactional support or a visual schedule, which gives information to the child in terms of what the expectations are. And here the goal is for the student to be able to use this type of support independently. And that's really what SCERTS is about. So we're going to provide the support, we're going to teach the child how to use it, and then we know it's working when the child is using this to guide their behavior. And what we would say is the child's able to use language for that function at this point. And finally, at the conversational partner stage, I mentioned our goal is helping children to be able to reflect on what types of regulatory strategies are appropriate given the context that they're currently in. So again, shifting from managing behavior and giving students that immediate feedback to being able to expand their own strategies. And this is an example of a vocal volume meter, and you can see that on one side there's information about what's expected, and then on the other side it's where that student's current volume is, but helping that child come up with a strategy which will make sure that there's a match between the two. So the final slide that we're including in this portion of the presentation is a quote from Ros Blackburn. And she's a woman with autism who is very insightful in terms of her experience of living with autism. And we often learn great lessons from individuals with autism. And this quote is that behavior is not the issue in autism, but it's a byproduct or the end result of autism. And what Ros is really referring to here is that the behavior or the challenging behaviors that are often seen in autism result from the communication difficulties that individuals with autism experience, as well as the emotional regulatory challenges. And this highlights for us the need to support the children or the students in our lives' development in these areas so that they don't need to rely on behavior, but they have the developmental capacities to express themselves and to be able to cope with challenging situations as they occur. So now it's my great pleasure to hand over this presentation to Emily Rubin, speech and language pathologist, who's going to talk to us about the third and final domain of the SCERTS model, which is transactional support, which really refers to the partner behavior that both Barry and I have been talking about throughout the presentation thus far.
Thank you, Amy. You have shared with us the critical priorities in social communication and emotional regulation that are emphasized in the SCERTS model. By zeroing in on a child's developmental levels in each of these areas, we are much better able to provide what we call transactional support. In my portion of this presentation, I will help define what is meant by transactional support. I will provide some practical examples, and I'm going to end with a case example in a classroom setting. The transactional support domain in the SCERTS model refers to the interpersonal supports and the learning supports that are implemented to support a child's active learning and engagement and development. This domain also includes the development of plans to support families, professionals, and service providers so that they can develop the tools that the child needs to make sense of their environments and to be active participants. Clearly in the SCERTS model, we recognize that a child's partners play a critical role for helping a child with autism feel safe and successful in social situations. Interpersonal supports refer to all the adjustments that we make in our communicative style that help a child learn to initiate more, to use more conventional language, as well as to meet the demands of everyday life by developing coping strategies. The learning supports refer to the environmental arrangements we make to entice children to engage with us in the social world, to remember what to say, and to help a child understand social situations. This is one of my favorite quotes. I have high expectations for people with ASD, but with appropriate and, when necessary, high levels of support. The person who gave us this insight is Ros Blackburn, an adult with autism. She felt that a key factor in her success was the fact that her family and educators had very high expectations for her in school and in life, but that those expectations came with the same expectations for those around her to provide her with the environmental modifications and interactive supports that would enable her to feel comfortable and safe around people and to be successful in social situations. This is what we call transactional support. In one of the special schools that we supported in England to adopt the framework, a milestone of our success in implementing SCERTS occurred when the head of the school mentioned that her staff were no longer coming to her with concerns about their students' behavior. Rather, she said, they were coming to her to say that they needed help in better understanding why behaviors had occurred and what could they do differently to prevent and support a child in those situations. In the next few slides, I will plan to highlight some of the most essential transactional supports that are provided when implementing the SCERTS model. Children with autism may not be compelled as other children to follow adults' direction and engage in tasks simply to please us or to obtain our social praise. Therefore, we recognize that one of the most essential transactional supports in the SCERTS model is to infuse motivating materials and topics within the activities that we're asking them to engage in. We have often relied on external rewards as a means to coerce children with autism to participate in adult-directed tasks. For example, I often go into situations where I see, first, do your work, and then you can be rewarded. The reward in these situations is all too often an opportunity to be alone, playing on the computer or bouncing on a therapy ball. And if we do little to change the nature of the tasks being required of the child's going to quickly learn that being alone is a lot more preferable. In contrast, if we provide the transactional support of inviting the child to engage with us by infusing motivating materials into the targeted activities, the tasks themselves and our association with those tasks become more desirable. In the first example that you see here, you're going to see the use of multisensory materials as a part of a sorting task for a math center in a classroom. As children transition into this center, they're literally handed a fishing net to help them gather the materials in the fish tank. And that's going to entice them to want to sort and organize what they've gathered. The activity in and of itself then becomes a reward and is intrinsically motivating. In the next example, a child who has developed an increased motivation to engage with his peers is provided with a context to learn how to decode words that's highly engaging. Each time he reads an action word such as hug, he's given the opportunity to choose a peer to make a social request for this action, like Jamie hug, and he gets to engage in that as a kind of intrinsic reward for the activity itself. For children who are more motivated by sensory action than social action, the task might involve, for example, tracing the first letter of one's name, but having that letter embedded in the entire word of that child's name, and then paired with a phrase like Michael blow bubbles. So each time the child writes the letter or traces his name, it might result in a request for bubbles to be blown. These types of transactional supports, infusing motivating materials in tasks, are considered essential when implementing the SCERTS model during academic lessons. Providing visuals to enhance smooth transitions is another essential transactional support. In the SCERTS model, we ensure that visuals are not only provided for each transition, but that these visuals are developmentally sensible or stage-specific. Children who are at the social partner stage, for example, are before words. As you see here in this particular image, a child benefits not only from a picture symbol representing that it's time to leave the playground and go to a snack time, but he's also provided with the actual materials or an object of reference, which you will see on the left-hand side, a container of a preferred snack item. That child can better understand and predict the sequence of adult-directed activities. This type of transactional support also helps the child develop their own self-regulation. Certainly is going to reduce the need for us to prompt them with physical guidance to make those transitions. Children who are at the language partner stage are developing their use of language to self-regulate. Children at this stage benefit from the use of pictures to indicate when they are expected to transition across the day. In this picture schedule, you will see that an arrow is in use for children to see where they are and what is coming next. Again, this will help their self-regulation skills emerge. Children who are at the conversational partner stage are developing their use of cognitive and planning skills to self-regulate. So the transactional support that we provide to enhance smooth transitions might involve a written, time-ordered agenda so that child can prepare for their day and even begin to self-advocate for supports that may be needed in future activities. The idea of fading out these types of visual supports makes little sense in the SCERTS model. We have a long way to go toward teaching children more mature visuals that they can access or develop as they develop and grow. Defining steps within a task is another example of our role in helping children sort out what others are thinking and feeling. This is another essential transactional support. We can clarify the steps toward completion. When we do so, children understand the expectations in a more concrete way while developing their use of self-talk for self-regulation. This example shows the use of a picture sequence during a drawing activity. For children who have less language, we might define the steps by laying out materials they need from left to right. And if a child has even more language and more written language skills, might simply write down the steps of the tasks, maybe on a dry erase board, so they can be more independent in completing the activities and less reliant on our verbal direction and prompting. Providing transactional support for a child's emotional regulation is another key essential element of the SCERTS model. We want to do so in a proactive manner. Rather than coming up with a strategy for that child to calm and settle down after they become stressed by the social world, imagine the empowerment that comes with having a plan before this even happens. So what we're going to be doing is modeling stage-specific strategies for that child to self-regulate. In this example, a 16-year-old young man with minimal language was provided with the transactional support of a place to hide and calm when he was distressed. When a child has minimal language, modifying the sensory properties of the environment with this kind of a space enables him to escape the social world in a safe and appropriate way. The staff clearly provided him with this transactional support well before he became too distressed to respond to them and tolerate redirection. We also want to model stage-specific strategies to self-regulate once children do develop the ability to use language to communicate. We can provide the transactional support of visuals so that they remember to express their emotion and to use language to ask for coping strategies so they can learn that the people around them are actually a helpful source of comfort and support. This example shows a visual that was taped to a kindergarten student's desk. Written in a child perspective language, he may learn to state, when I feel worried, when I feel angry, when I feel tired, maybe I can ask for help, I can ask for a drink of water, I can stretch, and then I can feel better. So this visual support kind of gives that child a reminder of what to do in the classroom setting to express emotion and to ask for help. If only every environment had this kind of transactional support, I think we would all be a little bit more capable of regulating our emotions. Now let's practice with a case example. One of the key areas that we emphasize in learning the SCERTS model is to foster effective coaching techniques so that we can support those who are supporting the child at home or in school or in a wide range of settings. Effective coaching follows the format of recognizing what the children are doing well in an activity, what transactional supports are already in place and are working, and areas where the child might be able to increase their initiation and independence with additional transactional support. In the following video segments, you will see a video that we refer to as a baseline video. There are a number of transactional supports in place at the starting point. However, you're probably going to notice that there's some opportunities to increase the child's rate of interaction, his independence, and his engagement with his peers. Following a coaching session, you're going to be able to see a follow-up video that includes several additional transactional supports that are going to make a significant impact on his active engagement in the classroom setting. In the first video, which I refer to as a baseline, you will see a math lesson in a general education first grade classroom. The whole class is learning how to play a dice game that each will get to play with a peer. The game involves trading up coins, the coin denomination game, so that they learn pennies to nickels, nickels to dimes, dimes to quarters, and so forth. Our case example is Jaron, a conversational level student who is seen closest to the camera. He has a dry erase board directly in front of him, which is not clearly evident in the video, unfortunately. Support includes his daily schedule and the written expectations of sitting quietly and sitting nicely. There is an aide present in the room, and she's going to be giving him happy faces to reward him for these behaviors. If he receives 5 happy faces, he is clearly anticipating a nice reward, as he's going to be sitting nicer and quieter than pretty much anyone else in the room. You already may notice in the background that some of the children are sitting in unusual positions. You'll see a fetal position back there. You'll see a child kind of playing in his football jersey. You're even going to see a child in the background that's just dancing the entire time. The curious things about these seating positions is that these children are actually not disengaged from the lesson. They're very interested, and they're actually paying attention quite a bit. You will see that these peers are eager to engage and ready to learn. In the initial video, you're going to see Jaron interacting with a peer at the latter end of the activity. Remember, as you watch this video, that our coaching processes build off of our successes. You will see some transactional supports in place, but you may also see areas where this student might be able to engage more frequently and more independently if he was given additional transactional support. Here is the baseline video.
We have our money in front of us. We're each going to take our turn to roll the cube and see how many dots come up, right? If you play, can I get you guys to scoot back where you were? That was much nicer. Good. So you can jump in pole to see who goes first, but you need to stay in that order. So I'm just going to tell you right now, I'll go first. You go second, you go third, okay? Okay, so I'm going to roll my coin, my cube, and I got 3 dots.
So you get 3 dots.
Okay, so sit down. I'm going to take 3, that means I get to take 3 cents or 3 pennies from the tray. 1, 2, 3. Okay? Now, I have 3 pennies. My turn is over, and it's Tyler's turn.
But nobody has to be.
Okay, so Tyler, she takes 2 means 2 cents. 2 of the brown pennies. Okay? No. So Tyler has 2 cents.
Give it back.
Okay, whose turn is it now? Start over. It's my turn again. So I get to roll again.
After watching the initial video, the educational team followed a process that is used when implementing the SCERTS model that involves identifying effective transactional supports that were already in place. The team remarked that his dry erase board with his schedule and the expectations of sitting nicely and sitting quietly clearly showed how visuals could be helpful for Jaron. They were also quite impressed by the fact that this was a hands-on activity that seemed to have a motivating context for learning math, and that he was given an opportunity to engage with his peers. These were very nice opportunities for him to practice his initiations. This review of successful supports was then followed with some questions that were posed related to a student's active engagement. Did it appear that Jaron could initiate his initiations or increase his initiations during that group instruction? Did it appear that Jaron could increase his independence during the game? These are the kind of questions that we're going to pose when we're implementing the SCERTS model, because we're always looking for increasing the frequency of initiations and active engagement. Those questions did help generate some new transactional supports to help Jaron remember what to say to his peers during a lesson. For example, a chart was generated so he could trade up 5 pennies equals a nickel, 2 nickels equals a dime. And a visual was also provided to define steps within the task during the time with his peers so he could be more independent. A little help box, if you will, that said, roll the dice, count the dots, trade up, give your dice to your peer. With these supports, you're going to see an increase in Jaron's rate of initiations, his independence, and a lot more emotional investment. You may not only see this change in Jaron, but you're going to see a change in the larger group as well. In the next video, you're also going to see the role of the educational assistant changing from that of an aide to an independence facilitator. This is a much-needed title shift in our field, as we want our children to be facilitated in their independence, not to have a personal assistant throughout their day. Once the chart and the visual step-by-step guidance are put into place, the independence facilitator can easily walk away, and Jaron's peer essentially is empowered to engage, collaborate, and model appropriate actions for him. Now you're going to see a video that was taken after these transactional supports were implemented. Please notice that Jaron is more engaged with his peers, he's initiating with them more, and he's more independent with the task expectations. The added benefit of these transactional supports in the lesson also fosters more active engagement with the whole group.
If I get 5 pennies, I can trade for a nickel. So Miss Laura made a sheet for us to help us understand how to make the trades better. Thank you. Okay. So it says, place your coins on the mat, and when you reach an equal sign, trade up and move the coin to the next line. So if I get, okay, if I get, can you guys share that one? Have it? Can you and Iverson share? Can you share with Sharon?
Yes,
I want you to look together, share together.
I'm your boss.
I hope from this example, you will see what Carol Gray, a good friend of ours, explained about transactional support. She said that while on occasion we can be part of the problem, she also told us we can be part of the solution. Barry is now going to take back over again and summarize some key takeaways from the introduction that you have been provided for the SCERTS model, and I believe this will then be followed by a question and answer session.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you both to Emily and Amy for giving a really nice overview of the SCERTS model and just some examples of ways that we support students. We see SCERTS not only as providing strategies for those students at Tier 3 and Tiers 2 and 3 that need a lot more support, but when these types of strategies to support social communication and emotional regulation become part of the school climate, then we see a lot more efforts to prevent problem behavior. As a matter of fact, let me just share a very brief story with you. I was working and consulting to a school, and we've all heard this from various administrators. A school principal indicated that after SCERTS was implemented to support students with identified disabilities, this principal said, you know, focusing on social communication and emotional regulation is something we need to do for all of our students. It will support their learning, and it will support their pro-social skills. So when we think about SCERTS from this bigger picture, we know that progress in social communication and emotional regulation are both very important predictors of school success. As we've indicated, prevents the development of problem behavior and supports positive relationships with both peers as well as adult staff. To help students be successful, to be much more conversant in communication, and to develop those relationships and to be well regulated emotionally, That depends very much on the systematic implementation of appropriate supports throughout the school day. And that finally, the SCERTS model in and of itself provides the framework and the guidelines to maximize success in school. So Clay, I think we have some really great questions coming in, and we're ready to respond to some of those questions now.
Beautiful. Thank you for an absolutely wonderful webinar. I think we're all learning a ton here. So first question, how is it possible to focus on social communication and emotional regulation with all the pressure for teachers to focus on academic performance?
Clay, that's a great question. One of the things that we really believe about the SCERTS model is it provides the framework to support children in all activities. So we don't see this as a dichotomy in terms of focusing on social communication and emotional regulation versus academic performance. We see success in social communication and emotional regulation being a very important component of success in academics. So the types of supports we put into place, keeping students well regulated emotionally, and as the famous Russian psychologist said about social communication and learning, is that most learning, 70 to 80% of human learning, occurs in social contexts, which requires effectiveness in social communication.
Interesting. Amy, do you want to take this next one? How is SCERTS different from approaches that rely on behavior management strategy?
So as we introduced in the section of the webinar talking about emotional regulation is really focused on helping students acquire developmental capacities, strategies that they have themselves or how they're able to access other people to regulate their own emotion and their arousal level. So to delay transitions, to delay gratification, to tolerate transitions, those types of things. And that's really a different approach than a traditional behavioral approach, which really focuses on control and compliance and often consequences. Those approaches rely on external factors or other people to be in control, and the emotional regulation approach is really about developing capacity within the student themselves.
Interesting. Barry, here's one for you. How do you convince colleagues that focusing on emotional regulation is not simply letting students get away with quote-unquote bad behavior without strict consequences?
Well, it's very interesting that in our school consulting, very often we get this question. As a matter of fact, I was working with a behavioral consultant who really came to embrace an emotional regulation strategy in supporting students. And she said, but my colleagues are saying you're just letting them get away with crime. And we believe that an emotional regulation approach in the long term really helps a student in such a way that they do not have to engage in problematic behavior if they're well regulated and if they're supported appropriately. And I think this is also an appropriate time to mention that SCERTS is not just about supporting students with autism, that it's about supporting students who have challenges, especially in social communication and emotional regulation. Many mental health professionals who don't deal exclusively or even predominantly with students with autism are now finding the SCERTS model effective. But emotional regulation comes out of decades of research on the development of the capacity to be most engaged, to be able to be available for learning and engaging. So there's a strong research base that says if we could help students with the appropriate supports to do this independently, as Amy just mentioned, then we don't have to rely upon external control and consequences. And as a matter of fact, we're learning more and more that trying to control students' behavior primarily based upon consequences is not an effective approach. And Dan Crimmins had mentioned that in the previous webinar 2 hours.
Fascinating. Amy, are SCERTS strategies easily applied in the regular classroom setting? For example, can transactional support strategies be utilized in a general education environment with 24 kids?
Absolutely. So in the video examples that you all just watched, Jaron, the young boy, was involved in a regular education classroom. It was an inclusive setting, and you could see that the teacher was able to implement those supports really with that particular student in mind, but they benefited the class as a whole in terms of the class's ability to actively engage and connect and communicate with one another and kind of fill their roles in the different activities. So that's really the premise or the goal of SCERTS, is being able to put these supports and embed them in naturally occurring routines for students or naturally occurring activities to increase their active engagement and their ability to learn. And what we often find is that it benefits everybody in the class as well.
Barry, I hope you can take the next one here. Do you feel it's better to implement the SCERTS program in a few classes before introducing to the entire school to gauge success within the population?
Well, I think the answer really depends upon where the school is currently at. So for schools and agencies we've consulted to, in some cases, they come to us saying they've read about SCERTS or they've gone to some trainings and they really want to embrace SCERTS. And in that example, it could be introduced to the whole school if the school is looking at changing kind of their current way of doing business, if you will. In other situations, we have professionals, sometimes it's an SLP or an OT or a special educator or an educator who reads about SCERTS, who has been exposed to SCERTS. And they don't necessarily have everybody on board, or they have some good questions coming from other staff about SCERTS. And in that case, we sometimes recommend, well, why don't we have some pilot classrooms where we could really engage the staff, train the staff well, and have them implement the SCERTS model to help other people in the school or in the agency understand what SCERTS is about. So in a sense, it's a top-down versus bottom-up approach. A top-down approach would be exposing the whole agency or school to SCERTS and all of the staff simultaneously, as opposed to a bottom-up approach. We also talk about predictors for success of SCERTS being implemented in a school setting. And so that has to do with the current training philosophy and experience of the staff. So for example, a school that already has a good team-based model would be much more likely to be successful with SCERTS for a school-wide approach. When folks in the school are very developmentally trained, that would be another example of SCERTS being successful. If a school program already uses multimodal teaching and a lot of visual supports in all of their classrooms, then that would be a very strong positive predictor of SCERTS being implemented. So the answer to the question really is, and this is very much SCERTS philosophy, when we work with families, we want to be able to approach the families with where they're at. When we work with students and staff, we want to approach them with where they're at developmentally. And so when we work with a whole school or agency, we want to approach them with where they're at and provide the appropriate supports to enable them to adopt and implement SCERTS.
Amy, I'm wondering if you can tell us, how do you measure progress in social communication and emotional regulation?
Sure thing. So when we talked about the overview of social communication and emotional regulation, I introduced the concept of a curriculum within the SCERTS model. And that curriculum we use as an assessment. It's a scope and sequence of goals and objectives, really. And that scope and sequence of goals and objectives is used to select objectives that can be embedded directly into a child's IFSP or IEP, which can be monitored on a regular basis as IEPs and IFSPs are done. So we can look for progress in that traditional monitoring that we tend to use in those environments, the school environment. One of the things that's really important to mention when we talk about progress in social communication and emotional regulation is we're really looking for a child to be able to demonstrate their skills or abilities in those areas in a variety of different contexts with a variety of different people. So it's not just can a child or a student do something in an activity or in a therapy session. We want to know, are they demonstrating a greater ability to initiate interactions with people out on the playground, within the context of the cafeteria, and in the classroom as well. And that's going to extend to the home environment. We really think across context, so home, school, and community. So Barry's reminding me that we talk about this as authentic progress, progress that really has meaning because it contributes to the individual's quality of life and really shows that they've gain developmental capacity that they're able to use, as I said, across different activities and environments. One of the other things to talk about here in terms of progress in terms of social communication and emotional regulation is how do we measure that programmatically? And within the context of the SCERTS program and the SCERTS manuals, we've got some forms called the SCERTS quality indicators. And those are forms that we can really use in a school or in a classroom to demonstrate how that staff is moving forward with supporting kids in terms of their acquisition of greater communication and regulatory skills as well. So we kind of think about it from a variety of different perspectives, both for the individual student as well as the classroom, but we're always thinking about it within the context of where the child or the student needs to function.
Barry, how do you involve families? How do you help parents understand SCERTS?
Yes, one of the limitations of just having an hour is that we can't get into all the aspects of SCERTS at the depth we would like to. SCERTS is a very family-centered model, and again, we like to say that we truly walk the walk, we just don't talk the talk. Built into the SCERTS assessment process, we get detailed information from parents, both through questionnaire and through interviews, and they actually can be involved in the assessment process by helping us understand their child's challenges and their child's strengths across many different settings. We actually ask parents after we finish a SCERTS assessment, do they feel it's an accurate picture of their son or their daughter? And we really try to connect with families at their level. So under transactional support, we have components that we refer to as educational support and emotional support for families. And we actually build into a plan how we are supporting parents and families educationally and emotionally. And if you want to get a better sense of this, one of the previous webinars I did for Presence Learning was on family professional collaboration. And much of what I spoke about in that webinar certainly was greatly influenced by our practices in the SCERTS model.
Amy, SCERTS seems very detailed and comprehensive. How do you suggest that a school moves into adopting SCERTS?
So as Barry mentioned in one of the previous questions, I think, for a school to really think about where they are in terms of some of those indicators that Barry mentioned that are prognostic for success, so the administrative support, the teaming approach, the family-centeredness, and to be able to identify kind of where they are currently functioning with those will help a school identify whether they're ready for that more top-down approach where they think globally about what things really help propel SCERTS forward or are consistent with SCERTS practice and try to do that across the school, or that really detailed bottom-up approach where they look at an individual child or an individual classroom and try to do SCERTS assessment processes and move forward. So there's lots of different ways to think about moving forward. One of the other things that we'd like to mention is when you're going to archive this webinar, I know you'll be talking a little bit more about that, that there'll be a resource list posted for the registrants to be able to take a look at, and that will give individuals more resources and ideas about how to move forward with adopting SCERTS and some different resources that could help them with that.
Great. Barry, I hope you can take this one. What type of training is needed for SCERTS to be implemented by a school-based team?
One of the things that we like to emphasize, Clay, is that moving into SCERTS is a process. And in terms of the type of training, as I alluded to earlier, it really depends upon what that team comes to us with and what they bring to SCERTS. So, for example, being a team-based approach, SCERTS is always much more successfully implemented when there is input and true collaboration amongst speech-language pathologists, occupational therapists, school psychologists, special educators, regular educators, and certainly with that support from the administration, as we've mentioned. We do introductory and advanced trainings live on the SCERTS model, and on the resource sheet you will see the websites of the SCERTS collaborators, and you could check into where trainings are being provided. One of the things that we're hoping will happen in the future is the possibility of more in-depth web-based training beyond the very brief introductory level that we've spoke about today. So right now, there's a great demand for information on CERTS. We certainly have a number of publications that are available on SCERTS.com as well as on our individual websites that can be downloaded. But stay tuned for more information about ways for school-based teams and professionals to be trained in the CERTS model.
Great. Now, I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. We'll see how it goes. Barry and Amy, could you share your thoughts on general education teachers? Specifically, we're wondering how easily these strategies can be taught to and implemented by a general education teacher within a mainstream classroom.
That's a great question. So I think, again, if you think about the video example that we used as part of this presentation, it gives us some information as to how a regular education teacher is able to embed some of these strategies in a regular education environment. And I'd also like to mention that there's lots of ongoing research regarding CERTS, and particularly our colleague Amy Weatherby, who's at Florida State University, is spearheading a project called Classroom CERTS Intervention. And that intervention study was a 4-year grant that looked at the implementation of CERTS within regular and special education environments. But this was really about training regular education teachers to implement the CERTS framework within their classrooms. And it's a little too early to talk about the results, but they'll be coming out soon, and Amy's rather excited about them. So it's something that we've been able to demonstrate both within all of our consulting practices and our individual work with individual teachers and students, as well as through the education that we've done. But now it looks as though we'll have some good research to back up that regular education teachers are able to take these strategies and infuse them in their classrooms with fair ease and good results as well.
Wonderful. Barry, is there anything you want to add to that before we close?
Well, I would just like to add, especially because some of the previous webinars in this series, presented within a positive behavioral support model, and that is CERTS has been adopted in schools that have already been trained in PBS or PBIS, and the feedback we get is that PBIS helps to set the general set of values that will guide the school, and certainly helps the school administration communicate that to all of the teachers. And that CERTS does that as well, but CERTS gets down to specific individual and individualized strategies for individual students. And so, as we've said over and over again, this is not just about students with autism, it's about students who have challenges in other developmental capacities, especially social communication and emotional regulation, but it's also about setting the appropriate school climate that supports all students in their learning and regulation.
Wonderful. Barry, Amy, thank you. We had a flood of questions coming in and still coming in, but sadly we are out of time, so we need to wrap up today's program. If you are considering a new phase of your career, presence learning is growing incredibly rapidly. So if you want to work from home, or you know someone who wants to work from home on their own schedule and wants to make a difference in children's lives, please refer them to our website to learn more about working online with presence learning. We look for the best speech therapists, occupational therapists, counselors, psychologists, social workers, special education teachers out there. You may wonder what happens next. You'll be getting an email from me with your certificate of attendance and links to the recording of today's program and a resource handout. Please share the link and recommend this program to your colleagues, as well as others in this series and our entire SPED Ahead archive of nearly 40 professional development programs from our expert faculty. For those of you who have requested ASHA CEUs, we will immediately submit your attendance information to ASHA, but know that it may take a few weeks for them to update your records. This webinar wraps up our fall 2015 season, and what a great season it was. Over 10,000 people from the world of special ed and related services have engaged with our series this fall, and we hope it has been a productive and provocative conversation. Watch for details about our upcoming 2016 series about to start in February with a theme of Success for Every Learner. We have an exciting lineup of speakers, including the return of an audience favorite, Friend of Presence Learning, Dr. Francis Stetson, and a couple of new voices, including Dr. Ed Duncan Blau, one of the originators of the social emotional learning movement, and Dr. Ross Green, a best-selling author, speaker, and psychologist who originated the CPS care model for students with serious challenges. As always, we have designed our series to be informative and challenging for our audience, special education directors and clinical professionals, and encourage them to take a hard look at the uncomfortable realities in our school systems and to consider some of the new solutions for reaching every single student. Finally, I would like to thank all of you for participating and for the wonderful team here that puts on these webinars. Everyone at Presence Learning is committed to unlocking the potential of every child and providing you with world-class professional development. Be assured your feedback and suggestions for our programs is very important and used to help design and refine these programs. So, in a moment, you'll be directed to a feedback survey on today's webinar. Please let us know what you thought about today's program and your suggestions for future topics and speakers. In addition, if you are interested in more in-depth training on SCERTS, you'll get a chance to get more information on that after this webinar. For more info or to see a live demo of Presence Learning online special education and related services, including online delivery of speech therapy, occupational therapy, and behavioral and mental health services, as well as assessments, email us at schools@presencelearning.com. Thanks again, and we appreciate you being here. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.